All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us for tonight's Protecting the Rights of Women and Girls from Discriminatory Practices. My name is Mattea Merta, and I'm the Global Policy and Advocacy Advisor, as well as UN representative with Campaign Life Coalition, who is co-sponsoring this event tonight alongside Alliance Defending Freedom. Tonight, we will hear from Canadian Member of Parliament for Yorkton, Melville, Cathay Wagantall, Physician and Medical Director, Dr. Kiely Williams, and Director of UN Advocacy with ADF International, Elyssa Koren. But first, I would like to say a few words about Campaign Life Coalition and our vision for this 65th Commission on the Status of Women. As an NGO in special consultative status with the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, Campaign Life Coalition reaffirms the inalienable human rights of every human being and calls upon the global community to uphold long-standing UN declarations and conventions that recognize that every human being at every stage of development has the inherent right to life before and after birth, and that this right, this primary right, should be protected by law. The 64th Commission on the Status of Women adopted a political declaration on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of the Fourth World Conference on Women, stating, and I quote, "We recognize that 25 years after the Fourth Conference on Women, no country has fully achieved gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls, that significant levels of inequality still persist globally, that many women and girls experience multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, vulnerability, and marginalization throughout their life course," end of quote. We believe that inequality and discrimination will continue to prevail unless the global community takes adequate measures towards ending one of the most blatant forms of violence and discrimination against women and girls, the ongoing practice of sex-selective abortion. Article 6 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child clearly states, and I quote, "States parties recognize that every child has the inherent right to life," end of quote. And this right belongs to every child born or unborn. If Article 6 is not reinforced by the 65th Commission on the Status of Women, and this barbaric practice is not addressed with concrete actions by governments and civil society, gender equality will never be achieved. Let us remember that the Beijing Platform for Action, which is really a founding document of the Commission on the Status of Women, also calls upon states to eliminate sex-selective abortion. Additionally, the Platform for Action, quoting the International Conference on Population and Development, reminds member states and the UN implementing agencies that in no case should abortion be promoted as a method of family planning. Any measures or changes related to abortion within the health system can only be determined at the national or local level according to the national legislative process. And finally, every attempt should be made to eliminate the need for abortion. These guidelines are quite clear, and what is now required is the will to follow them. The 2020 World Population Report, issued by the United Nations Population Fund, states that 1.2 million girls are intentionally selected for death annually by abortion for the simple fact that they are girls. This sex imbalance leads to heightened levels of rape, coerced sex, sexual exploitation, trafficking, child marriage, and overall violence against women and girls worldwide. Countries have a vested interest in rejecting the harmful practice of sex-selective abortions, both for the safety of its women and girls, but also for the benefit in the areas of development, production, and healthcare. UNFPA's report Against My Will, Defying the Practices That Harm Women and Girls and Undermine Equality, speaks to the issue of sex-selective abortion by referring to several studies which state, and I quote, "More than 140 million females are considered missing today as a consequence not only of gender-biased sex selection, but also postnatal sex selection," end of quote. The report also says, the effects of sex ratio imbalances ripple throughout societies and help perpetuate the gender inequality that led to them in the first place. When women's and girls' primary right, which is their right to life, is defended by the global community, it sends a direct message to proponents of sex-selective abortion that the lives of women and girls, just like the lives of men and boys, before and after birth, must be protected. Women and girls are powerful agents of change, both locally and internationally, and the world needs more women and girls, not less. Their active roles in the family, the community, the workforce, and culture at large produce higher levels of economic growth, increased health amongst her members, and a brighter future for the sustainable development of all societies. So with that, I will turn the mic over to our three wonderful panelists who will elaborate further on this very important issue, pulling from their vast experience and current work. Our first speaker is Canadian Member of Parliament for Yorkton Melville, Cathay Wagantall. MP Wagantall was elected into office first in 2015. She's a member of the Standing Committee on Veterans Affairs and chair of the National Prayer Breakfast of Canada. Since coming into office, MP Wagantall has been a staunch defender of the rights of the vulnerable, sponsoring bills such as Cassie and Molly's Law. In February of 2020, MP Wagantall introduced the Sex-Selective Abortion Act, or Bill C-233, into the House of Commons. If passed, the bill would amend the criminal code to prohibit a medical practitioner from knowingly performing a sex-selective abortion. Seeing as sex-selective abortion happens every day in Canada, adopting appropriate legislation to end discrimination against any person based on sex is a part of Canada's commitment to advancing human rights, and MP Wagantall's bill addresses inequality between the sexes in its earliest forms. And with that, I hand the floor over to you, MP Wagantall.
Thank you so much. I do want to begin by thanking Campaign Life and ADF International for the opportunity to present a movement that's taking place in Canada today regarding sex-selective abortion. I hope this evening is an opportunity to be encouraged by my efforts as a Canadian Member of Parliament to bring forward legislation that protects preborn baby girls and reflects the values of most Canadians. The 2021 priority theme of CSW65 calls for women's full and effective participation and decision-making in public life, as well as the elimination of violence, for achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. As you're aware, violence against women is condemned in the 1995 United Nations Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. And the violence condemned includes forced sterilization and forced abortion, coercive forced use of contraceptives, female infanticide, and prenatal sex selection. There's a persistent and overlooked form of gender inequality deserving urgent attention and a concerted legislative response. During the past quarter century alone, sex-selective abortion has deprived over 100 million women and girls the opportunity to live, work, and affect change through their very unique abilities. In 2011, an interagency statement by UN Women and the OHCHR, UNFPA, UNICEF, and the WHO called for a renewed effort by government and civil society to address the deeply rooted gender discrimination against women and girls, which lies at the heart of sex selection abortion. Another 10 years have passed since that statement. And I believe it's time for all member states, UN Women, and civil society to follow these commitments through for empowerment of all women and girls. We all know words are meaningless, no matter where they originate, if they are simply words and no more. While it's common and very important to point to large troubling sex ratios of birth in India and China, as well as cultures where the boy child is deemed more essential than the girl child, let us not discount the impact of this practice in OECD member states such as my country, Canada, where male to female sex ratios are as high as 1.96 and have been recorded. The absence of any law to protect the girl child states that sex-selective abortion is permissible in my country. In Canada, we have no laws against abortion, none. We are the only democratic country that has no laws. And the only other country that also fails in any way to protect preborn children is North Korea. On February 26, 2020, as Mattea mentioned, I introduced the Sex-Selective Abortion Act, Bill C-233, in the House of Commons. This enactment amends the criminal code to make it an offense for a medical practitioner to perform an abortion knowing that the abortion is solely sought on the grounds of the child's genetic sex. It also requires the Minister of Health, in consultation with representatives of the provincial governments who are responsible for health, to come together to establish guidelines respecting information provided by a medical practitioner in relation to a request for an abortion. Sex-selective abortion happens in Canada. It's not permissible in a society that advocates for equality of the sexes. Adopting appropriate legislation to end discrimination against any person based on sex is part of Canada's commitment to advancing human rights. Well, my bill addresses inequality between the sexes at the earliest stages of life. Canada is a country that values equality of the sexes, and sex-selective abortion inherently denies the equal value that we claim that we support. If a baby girl is unwanted simply because she's a girl, I am pleased to say that most Canadians now believe that this has gone too far. I'm pleased to say that there's a new reality rising in Canada. A very recent national poll found that a majority of Canadians would be more likely to support a political party if that party promised to legally restrict sex-selective abortion in Canada. Among the results, 52% of Canadians overall, 56% of those with a postgraduate degree, 58% of those who voted Conservative in 2019, 51% of those who voted Liberal, and 61% of those who voted for the Bloc would be moderately to much more likely to vote for a party that promised to restrict sex-selective abortion. This critical mass is reason enough for political parties to do what Canadians are demanding them to do, to legally restrict sex-selective abortions in Canada. Evidently, there is unity across this country for Canada to assert itself on this fundamental human rights issue. This poll I just mentioned comes less than a year after the results of a 2019 Dart and Maru Blue poll conducted for the National Post, which found that 84% of Canadians believe it should be illegal to have an abortion if the family does not want the baby to be a certain sex. I've been so honored and humbled by the support I've received from thousands of Canadians opposed to sex-selective abortion. These 2019 poll results only reinforce that Canadians are united on the need to set reasonable boundaries on abortion that reflect Canada's values at home and on the world stage. Petitions in support of this majority view to criminalize sex-selective abortions in Canada were presented in the House of Commons, and they state, whereas sex selection abortion is legal, as Canada has no legal restrictions on abortion, sex-selective abortion is antithetical to our commitment to equality between men and women. And a 2019 Dart and Maru Blue poll conducted for the National Post showed that 84% of Canadians believe it should be illegal to have an abortion if the family does not want the child to be a certain sex. International organizations, including the World Health Organization, United Nations Women, and United Nations Children Fund, have identified unequal sex ratios at birth as a growing problem internationally. Canada's healthcare profession recognizes sex selection as a problem. So, therefore, we, the undersigned citizens of Canada that call upon the House of Commons to pass a criminal code at prohibition of sex selection abortion, are calling on this government to do this now. So, to thousands of signatures presented in the House of Commons, the Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, the Honourable David Lametti, responded. And this is what he said. The Government of Canada condemns all practices that are motivated by discriminatory views of women and girls, including sex-selective practices. In Canada, he says, the administration and funding of healthcare services is a provincial responsibility that falls under the purview of the provincial governments. As is the case for other medical procedures, the delivery of abortion services is determined by the policies of the provincial governments and the standards set by the medical profession itself, end quote. Well, Although the minister is correct about the provincial responsibility for procedural policies, in regards to abortion, our federal government has already created a precedent in law in regards to sex selection. Specifically, sex selection is already illegal in the case of embryos under the Assisted Human Reproduction Act 2004, Section 5E1E. In order to expand this protection to all preborn children, a criminal prohibition must be added to the criminal code. As well, in response to medical associations, the Canadian Medical Association itself has indicated that sex-selective abortions are a problem in Canada, following 2 studies peer-reviewed and published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal in 2016. Canada's health care profession has shown concern about sex-selective abortion and discourages the practice. In 2007, the executive of the Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists of Canada, the SOGC, issued a statement that medical technologies for the sole purpose of gender identification in pregnancy should not be used to accommodate societal preferences, and that the SOG does not support termination of pregnancy on the basis of gender. The College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario and the Colleges of Physicians and Surgeons of British Columbia also echo the SOGC's view. Clearly, with these views, coupled with the views of the majority of Canadians, it is past time to bring the Sex Selection Abortion Act into law. In its statement, the Vedic Hindu Cultural Society declared that C-233 is a reasonable limit on abortion that would work to enhance Canada's human rights image, and they're situated in British Columbia. The United Sikhs is a UN-affiliated, international nonprofit, non-governmental, humanitarian relief, human development, and advocacy organization aimed at empowering those in need, especially disadvantaged and minority communities across the world. The letter of endorsement signed by Sukhwinder Singh, the Canadian National Director of United Sikhs, notes that, and I quote, C-233 proposes a reasonable limit that would reflect Canada's respect for human rights at all stages of life. The practice of sex-selective abortion takes place in Canada, and it's our duty to defend those lives, those whose lives would be ended simply because of their sex, end quote. The majority of Canadians have indicated that our criminal code must reflect the values of Canadians, and their government must act now to condemn this practice and to make it clear to all that Canada values women and equality. If there's even one female preborn child who is terminated because of her sex, we need to act. Those I speak to, including a recent group of college students attending a women's studies class, are in disbelief that a country like Canada would permit this type of abortion. In the Post-Millennial, a March 7th, 2020 article states that sex-selective abortion is a cause that unites us in Canada. While some oppose abortion and some promote it, we should all be able to stand side by side against sex-selective abortion, as we all have an interest in standing against gender inequality. There is a realization that if a baby girl is unwanted simply because she's a girl, abortion on demand has gone too far, and we must respond. As a Canadian Member of Parliament, seeking to respond to these concerns for the vast majority of our population, I encourage others to seek to end this travesty in the countries that you call home. I encourage the Commission on the Status of Women to actively work to eliminate the most egregious forms of gender-based discrimination that are facing our world today. And I also want to encourage other legislators to make ending sex-selective abortion your highest priority for the sake of the girl, child, and women. Thank you.
Thank you, MP Wagantall, for your presentation, and even more so for bringing forward this very important piece of legislation. Next, we have Dr. Kiely Williams. Dr. Williams is board certified in family medicine. She graduated from the University of British Columbia Medical School and completed her family medicine training at the University of Calgary. During residency, Dr. Williams' clinical research investigated health outcomes of human trafficking victims locally, nationally, and globally. Her team developed a novel approach to identify potential victims of trafficking presenting for healthcare services. Upon graduation, Dr. Williams completed a hospitalist locum at Foothills Medical Center. Additionally, she worked with the obstetricians of Foothills Medical Center before transitioning into community family practice. Dr. Williams has a certificate in travel medicine and additional training in pediatric mental health. Dr. Williams holds an academic appointment as a clinical associate with the University of Calgary's Department of Family Medicine. She enjoys training medical students and resident physicians. She has also administered examinations for international medical graduates and has served on a variety of committees. In addition to her contributions with the University of Calgary, Dr. Williams has also been involved in health and human rights advocacy at the United Nations. Dr. Williams was named Medical Director of Advanced Primary Care in 2018. Dr. Williams is married to her husband, Craig, since 2001, and they have 3 young children. Dr. Williams, I turn the floor over to you.
Well, welcome everyone. I would like to begin by thanking all of you in advance at this parallel event and everyone who is interested and engaged and involved in protecting the rights of women and girls from discriminatory practices across the globe. It is such important work, and I cannot overstate how thankful I am for all of you. This sincere gratitude includes anyone attending who may not initially feel aligned with the desire to end sex-selective abortions. I am not thankful exclusively to those who have a shared ideology. I am thanking anyone with a passion for and commitment to protecting human rights and the rights of women and girls. So thank you truly to everyone in attendance today. Our panel is addressing gender-based violence against girls in the form of sex-selective abortion, a problem that exists due to son preference. We have been conditioned to believe that whenever someone uses the term abortion, we must instantly be polarized and triggered. I will spend the next 15 to 20 minutes outlining why that's not the case. Everyone who cares about women has far more in common than what any differences may suggest. Furthermore, when we begin from our common ground and proceed with honesty and bravery, we are in a position to make real change in eliminating gender-based violence and protecting the rights of women and girls from discriminatory practices. Over the course of this discussion, I will begin by outlining foundational principles that we all agree on. The second part of my presentation will explain why it is so critical that we are honest and consistent in our protection of the rights of girls. We will examine how, if we allow any room for some discrimination against some girls, we undermine all of our efforts to eliminate gender-based violence. This is particularly evident when we are discussing sex-selective abortion. With that introduction, let's begin with what we agree on. Number 1, we agree with human rights and gender equality. The UN Declaration of Human Rights states, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Article 2 of that same document states that everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. And Article 3 states simply that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and the security of person. Secondly, we agree that gender-based violence exists, must be combated and ended. The UNHCR defines gender-based violence as including sexual, physical, mental, and economic harm inflicted in public or in private. It also includes threats of violence, coercion, and manipulation. This can take many forms, such as intimate partner violence, sexual violence, child marriage, female genital mutilation, and so-called honor crimes. The consequences of gender-based violence are devastating and can have lifelong repercussions for survivors. It can even lead to death. In this definition, death is the ultimate harm in gender-based violence. Number 3, we agree that sex-selective abortion is a form of gender-based violence. In 2011, the WHO released an interagency statement with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the UNFPA, UNICEF, and UN Women, titled Preventing Gender-Biased Sex Selection. The document concludes by stating imbalanced sex ratios are an unacceptable manifestation of gender discrimination against girls and women and a violation of their human rights. Fourthly, we agree on the definition of life. It's a scientific definition that states that to be alive, an organism must grow, develop, use energy, reproduce, be made of cells, respond to its environment, adapt, and some definitions include be carbon-based. Regardless, once a human egg and a human sperm join, there's the creation of a new human organism with a new unique human genetic code, capable of every requirement to be classified as alive. For the purposes of our discussion today, we must also define the term abortion. The following definition, taken from the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, states that abortion is the termination of a pregnancy after, accompanied by, resulting in, or closely followed by the death of the embryo or fetus. We agree that before anything can die, it must first be alive. In sex-selective abortions, this means that girls are killed before they can even be born, simply because they are girls. So to summarize, we agree with human rights and gender equality. We agree that gender-based violence exists, must be combated and ended. We agree that sex-selective abortion is a form of gender-based violence. We agree on the definition of life and that abortion ends a life. I understand that all of the previous information may seem very basic, but it is important that we have the same starting point, because in the time remaining, I want to look at why ending sex-selective abortions is critical to all other work protecting the rights of women and girls from discriminatory practices. To do this, we'll look more closely at the interagency statement, Preventing Gender-Biased Sex Selection. This is a very good document that emphasizes the magnitude and the implications of the discriminatory practice of sex-selective abortions. As you heard earlier, the UNFPA estimates that today around 140 million women are believed to be missing around the world, the result of son preference, including gender-biased sex selection, a form of discrimination. It's critical to note that in this context, missing most likely means dead. Furthermore, in the case of sex-selective abortion, dead means intentionally killed because they were female. There is no greater human rights violation than death. If girls cannot have the right to life, they can have no other rights. The right to life is the most fundamental right. There are many great points in the 18-page statement, Preventing Gender-Biased Sex Selection. The document illustrates that ending the phenomenon of son preference and perpetuating the equality of girls and boys will take sustained effort. It will require legislative and cultural work done by both government and non-government organizations. The statement boldly and bravely concludes by declaring that imbalanced sex ratios are an unacceptable manifestation of gender discrimination against girls and women and a violation of their human rights. Based on our earlier review, this quote is undeniably true. To have sex-selective abortions, there must be a separate living female who is intentionally killed simply because she's a girl. She is denied her most basic human right, and therein she is denied all her human rights. There unfortunately is a critical problem in the approach advocated by this document. Initially, this problem appears slight and even looks like a balanced approach. However, when carefully evaluated, it provides a framework to undermine all the important work of the rest of the document. The problem arises when in many locations in the document, there are careful provisions made to protect safe and legal abortions that may be used for sex-selective purposes, but are disguised under other reasons for abortion. Why is this a problem when at first glance, it seems like balancing human rights? Please remember that in the context of sex-selective abortion, we are always talking about two living human females. When an abortion is successfully performed, it will always end the life of one of these females. That is its sole purpose. We have already demonstrated that a pregnancy is when one human female carries another human inside their body. Whenever we hear the term safe abortion, we must always ask ourselves, safe for who? Every successful sex-selective abortion is lethal for one of the females. Every sex-selective abortion is a denial of the most basic human right, the right to life, for one of the girls. We must also exercise caution when we hear the term legal. Legal does not always mean ethical or right. There are many countries where sex-selective abortions are legal. The United Nations has stated female infanticide and prenatal sex selection are, quote, harmful and unethical practices, end quote. When the United Nations Interagency Statement on Preventing Gender-Biased Sex Selection will allow space for sex-selective abortions under some circumstances, it subtly but completely undermines the purpose of the entire document. The United Nations represents the leaders in global advocacy and human rights. Please recall the beginning of the presentation where we reviewed the UN Declaration of Human Rights that stated, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. If those of us who attend the UN Commission on the Status of Women will not advocate for the abolition of all forms of violence against our small sisters in the womb, we undermine the foundations of worldwide freedom, justice, and peace. Please also recall Article 2 of the Declaration. Everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration, without distinction of any kind. That included sex and birth. If the same organization that makes this declaration will make space for the intentional violation of one girl's right to life to promote the situation of another human, we perpetuate entrenched discrimination that the rights of one girl can be violated in the name of benefiting another. This subtle balancing act of protecting safe and legal abortions that can be used for sex-selective purposes suddenly gives way to exactly the discrimination we are trying to end. We cannot end discrimination against women and girls by simultaneously allowing discrimination against some very small girls. This is why we need to be honest and why we need to be brave. Freedom always comes at a cost. Human rights for girls are hard won, and we must protect the rights of all girls, especially our smallest, most vulnerable sisters who literally do not have a voice. The United Nations, and particularly the Commission on the Status of Women, is the world leader in defending the rights of women and girls. If even we allow space for the right to life of some girls in some cases to be violated, then we must be honest. We cannot say that we defend the rights of all girls in all cases. The best we can say is we promote the rights of most girls in most circumstances. But until we end the practice of sex-selective abortion, we continue to enshrine the ideals of son preference, wherein most girls deserve rights in most cases, but not all girls all the time. It is so important to understand that unless we take a stand against all sex-selective abortion, the only thing that makes us different from those who practice sex-selective abortions is the criteria we assign to determine which girls have value and which do not. I want to say that one more time. Unless we take a stand against all sex-selective abortion, the only thing that makes us different from those who practice sex-selective abortion is the criteria we assign to determine which girls have value and which do not. Unless we take a stand against all sex-selective abortion, the statement on preventing gender-biased sex selection will forever be a house divided, simultaneously calling for a multifaceted approach to ending son preference, but allowing space to end the lives of some girls some of the time. Some girls will remain without their basic right to life called for in the UN Declaration. We will have protected space where they will join the 140 million missing girls around the world. As leaders in the advocacy and protection of the rights of women and girls, we cannot allow this to happen. We must be honest and we must be brave. We must not allow space for sex-selective abortions to end the lives of any girls. We must stand for all girls all of the time. In conclusion, we agree with human rights and gender equality. We agree that gender-based violence exists, must be combated and ended. We agree that sex-selective abortion is a form of gender-based violence. And we agree on the definition of life and that abortion ends a life. Now, as world leaders in protecting the rights of women and girls from discriminatory practices, we must advocate for an end to all sex-selective abortions and protection of the right to life for all women and girls. Thank you for your commitment, thank you for your passion, and thank you for your time. We have about 5 minutes left in the presentation. So in the time remaining, I want us to quickly look at similarities between the arguments given to allow the abortions of females and how they look in relation to historical examples of human rights violations. Discrimination always seems to follow a similar pattern. So I encourage all of you to think of some human rights violations that you're familiar with. There are unfortunately many global examples to choose from. We will look at 4 common excuses made for discrimination and 2 grounding questions to help us evaluate the validity of any argument. The first example is dehumanizing language. In this case, derogatory terms or terms intended to make the victim appear less human are used. The unborn child is routinely called a baby by healthcare providers and lay people alike. However, at the same gestational age, if a woman is considering a sex-selective abortion, the baby will be called a fetus. This is an effort to deny the humanity of the unborn girl child and make the human rights violation of sex-selective abortion appear less real. Dehumanizing language is routinely used in other examples of discrimination. Secondly, focusing on the actual or perceived benefits for those who are not having their human rights violated. Arguments defending sex-selective abortion frequently focus on the human who will continue living, not the girl who will be killed. This is similar to historical arguments against the abolition of slavery. Instead of acknowledging the deplorable conditions of the slaves, proponents ignored that and focused on the economic cost of the abolition of slavery. Likewise, with sex-selective abortion, the life of the unborn girl is ignored, and the focus is on the perceived benefits to those who will continue living. Number 3 is the viability argument. This position argues that the fetus is not human until it can survive outside the womb. It highlights differences between humans at different developmental stages and tries to use these differences to deny that very young girls are even human at all. Consider this. If I am suddenly relocated to Mars, I will die. I will die not because I am not human, but I will die precisely because I am human, and a human at my developmental stage cannot survive in that environment. Likewise, humans for approximately the first 40 weeks of their life are aquatic. If they are removed from that environment prematurely, without specialized equipment after 25 weeks, they will die. They will die not because they are not human. They will die because they are human, and humans at that developmental stage require that environment to sustain their life. Additionally, the gestational age at which children can survive outside the womb depends on access to specialized medical equipment. If we accept the viability argument, this means that children in resource-rich countries born to affluent families would become human earlier than those who have less resources. This is clearly discriminatory and untrue. The fourth and last example is using visible differences between human characteristics to claim some humans are not human at all. This argument is similar to the last example. Humans in their earliest stages of development do not look like humans at later stages. Humans across the globe have a terrible record of denying rights to other groups because they look different. Denying rights to girls in their early stage of development is simply our current practice of discrimination and dehumanization because they don't look like us, therefore we do not have to extend the same rights that we have. This argument is found in some form in almost all human rights violations, and this case is no different. Finally, I'll end with 2 anchoring questions that can help protect us from the above ideologies and evaluate the validity of any defenses given for sex-selective abortions. Number 1, if an argument is made to allow sex-selective abortion, would we accept the same argument to defend the killing of a 3-year-old female? Consider the examples of poverty, abuse, illness, too many siblings, too many females in the family, and other examples. The significance of these examples cannot be minimized. Many of them are very serious and they deserve the attention and intervention, but none of them are solved by the killing of girls, and none of them are an acceptable justification for the killing of girls. Lastly, do humans become pregnant with other humans? The answer is yes. So the more important question I will leave with you is, do we believe in human rights for all humans? And with that, I will return the floor to our moderator. Thank you again.
All right, thank you, Dr. Williams, for your presentation. Our next and final speaker is Elyssa Koren. Koren serves as Director of United Nations Advocacy in New York City, where she oversees ADF International's UN headquarters and Geneva legal teams. Koren's expertise is in international human rights law, with a focus on issues pertaining to the protection of life, parental rights, and freedom of conscience as they relate to state sovereignty and the multilateral system. Koren provides legal support to UN member state representatives to shape UN documents to protect and affirm the innate dignity of every person. She assists with crafting resolutions and legal arguments of negotiations. She participates annually in the work of the second and third committees of the General Assembly, the Commission on Social Development, the Commission on the Status of Women, the Commission on Population and Development, and the sessions of the Human Rights Council. She has also hosted numerous events on human rights and contemporary social issues at the United Nations in conjunction with member states. Koren has been published widely in various media outlets, including Newsweek, Daily Signal, and the Public Discourse, and regularly partakes in speaking engagements and training seminars on the UN and international human rights law. Koren obtained a JD and an MA in International Relations at the University of Toronto. She has also earned a BA in Political Science with a minor in History and International Development Studies at McGill University. She is also admitted to the bar in New York. The floor is yours, Ms. Koren.
Today, I really want to take the time building on the testimonies and the expertise that we've heard so far to emphasize really the solutions. What do we need to do in order to move past this problem that's been, I think, so clearly articulated at this point? And I think that to put it simply, really what we need to do is to emphasize two separate things. First, the importance of a legal response, that every country really needs to have a strong legal framework that prohibits sex-selective abortion. And second, of course, what we want to see is a corresponding shift in culture. And until we reach the point where this is unthinkable, we need to develop ways in which we reach this point. So that, of course, it means educational programs and the like. But really, when you see real cultural change, it's going to be contingent on, it's going to be the result of the laws that you have being prosecuted and actually being enforced. And so if we take a look at a case study, which is the situation in India, this is a country that ranks number 4 in the world for the most imbalanced sex ratio of girls to boys. I think here you can really see it really illustrates how important it is to have both of these things proceeding in tandem. You have to have the legal prohibitions and you also have the cultural shift. And my organization, ADF, we partner on the ground with ADF India, which is our affiliate, and the campaign Vanishing Girls. This is an initiative that's India-based, and it's really focused on saving the lives of the thousands of girls that are aborted in India every day. And as has been said, these girls are aborted for no other reason really than their sex. And Vanishing Girls does this by advocating for the strict enforcement of India's law. So India does have a law in place. It's called the Prohibition of Sex Selection Act. And this act has been on the books since 1994 in India. And it was amended in 2003 to extend to the regulation of preconception sex selection. And the way that the law is worded, it prohibits the determination and disclosure of the sex of the fetus for non-medical reasons. And it also bans advertisements related to preconception and prenatal determination of sex. So basically, a woman, when she's pregnant, she can't find out if she's having a baby girl or a baby boy out of fear that this determination would then be used to abort. And it makes it mandatory for all ultrasound clinics and diagnostic facilities to display prominently signboards in front of their offices, indicating that disclosure of the sex of the fetus is illegal and that they won't do it. And further, all such facilities have to be registered at the governmental level. So what you have here, you have a national context in which sex-selective abortion has been prohibited for almost 30 years, 3 decades. And yet the practice of sex selection in favor of sons remains extremely pervasive, and the situation is actually continuing to worsen in that country. And if we take a brief look at the numbers, you can really see the severity of the situation facing women and girls in India. Every minute, approximately 27 girls under age 5 will die in India due to neglect, malnourishment, and lack of access to medical facilities. So just if we look at it in terms of 1 hour of us speaking together on this call, that's 1,620 girls. So of course, all of those are not attributable to sex-selective abortion, but a significant portion are, and it's all related to the discriminatory treatment of these young girls. And over the last decade in India, 63 million girls have not made it past age 6 due to problems ranging from general poor nutrition to the practice of infanticide. And again, one of the primary reasons for this is sex-selective abortion. And these are problems that obviously they go so much far beyond, they far exceed the issue of sex-selective abortion alone. This is really systemic mistreatment and discrimination against girls. But obviously it starts with the targeting of girls in the womb, and that's both, you can say, emblematic of the general societal view of females, and at the same time, it really is a primary feeder or contributor of those numbers and of what we see happening there. And the widespread practice of aborting girls in the womb because they're girls, it really gives the impression, it gives the, the sense that girls have no value. And in many cases, it gives the view that they're better off dead than alive. And this is something that extends all the way through to this neglect that we see that's so pervasive. And then, of course, even to the really tragic, but in a sense, logical conclusion of that view, which is infanticide. So in this, you can see that India really literally faces a problem of vanishing girls. This is a phenomenon of a largely unseen victim. It's been transpiring in the country since the 1970s, when the practice of sex selection took off there, and that happened as it did everywhere that it's prevalent with the emergence of prenatal screening technologies. And census numbers showed a very quick decline. So by the time you hit the 1990s, the sex ratio had reached approximately a number of 941 girls for every 1,000 boys. And most recently in 2011, which is when they conducted the last census, that number dropped all the way to 918. And this year they should be conducting another census, and it's expected that it'll show a very similar, if not actually worse, imbalance. So as to the reason why this is happening in this country in particular, you can really tie it back to a very specific culture of son preference that relates largely to the issue of finances and marriage and the way that those two things are viewed in society. And this is not something that is frequently assumed, but actually the practice transpires across social classes and is in fact slightly more prevalent in affluent circles, simply because it's so expensive to procure an abortion on the basis of sex, considering that it is illegal. And I assume you have to jump through a variety of hoops to actually be able to make that happen. And likewise, it takes place in both cities and urban settings and in the country. So with regard to the laws in India, with regard to marriage and a family's financial obligations when a woman is wed, here again, we see a situation in which the laws in India are actually quite good. They've been adjusted to ban harmful practices relating to dowry, relating to equal inheritance rights for girls. For instance, the practice of dowry has actually been abolished in India, but it continues to take place. And the result of this is that girls are quite literally perceived as very expensive for families and not really a worthwhile investment, considering that they end up being passed on to their husband's family. And the same thing for inheritance rights. There is a law that mandates equal inheritance rights for girls and boys, but again, it doesn't occur in practice. And so this perpetuates a climate in which girls are simply less preferable to boys. And this has a whole variety of different cultural effects, many of which we can imagine. And sex trafficking is one that we hear about frequently. There's just a shortage of women to marry, so it creates increased demand to bring girls into the country and to move them around internally. Other human rights abuses include rape, sexual harassment, kidnapping, and a variety of other criminal offenses. which really just reveal a society-wide view that women are simply not equal, not perceived as equal in value to men. And furthermore, women that actually have their daughters, have baby girls, are subject to violence and to discrimination for the sheer fact of having a baby daughter. And of course, this perpetuates a cycle of violence when in which their daughters as well are subject to similar cycles of violence and discrimination. So again, a situation where in spite of the law, 7,000 girls in the womb are aborted every day in India because they're girls. And to show you how rarely this crime is prosecuted there, since 2018, less than 500 convictions have taken place under the act. So that's a rate of roughly one doctor suspended for every 300,067 girls. So very, very few prosecutions, and the implementation overall of the act has been very poor, very sporadic. It was worsened significantly by the pandemic, by the COVID-19 climate. And we can see in this that the answer really is strict prosecution of the law. If you want to reduce the number of sex-selective abortions in India, in a country where the laws are already on the books, if you want to restore balance to India's sex ratio and pave the way for a culture that really recognizes the equality of men and women, it's clear that the laws need to be upheld. And the way that the law is structured, it really is quite stringent. A medical practitioner that violates the law faces imprisonment for up to 3 years, a fine of 10,000 rupees this is for a first offense. If they do it again for a second offense, they can lose their license for up to 5 years, and then they can risk permanent suspension for doing it again. So it's very interesting here to note that it's not women that are subject to prosecution for violation of the act. It's doctors, it's screening professionals, it's others that are complicit in the procuring of abortions. And the theory or the philosophy behind this is really important to understand. The reason is that there's the assumption that regardless of the woman's circumstances, regardless of what she's facing, a woman that undergoes an abortion on the basis of sex in India is always going to be understood to be subject to coercion. And that's just simply by virtue of the tremendous societal pressures that she's under and what she faces when she goes in to procure that abortion. And really the numbers reflect this as well. If you look at the considerable number of women that go in for abortions that reveal coercion or that they were subject to a forced abortion on the basis of sex. So it's clear, it's doctors, it's screening professionals. These are the people that need to be held accountable, prosecuted under the law if we're going to see the crime of sex-selective abortion really be eliminated in the Indian national context. And national studies that actually have been conducted in India have shown actually save lives. Prosecuting offenders results in less sex-selective abortions. So when we debate this, when we talk about the appropriate response to sex-selective abortion, if we kind of shift away from the Indian context for a minute, let's just address a variety of the things that we hear. One of the first ones that is quite quick to come out is the argument that laws banning sex-selective abortion are ineffective. They don't work. India clearly demonstrates that a legal framework is not sufficient. It's not the answer solely to the problem of sex-selective abortion there. But I think we can say that it really is a prerequisite if we're going to see cultural change. And one country that's really interesting to look at is South Korea. It provides a very compelling example because they were essentially able to eradicate the practice essentially in one generation. And it's attributable to the fact that they had a no mercy policy for the way in which the law was put forth. And so the strict legal prohibition and the enforcement in that country, in South Korea, was really a great success. So you also, second, you get this view that sex-selective abortion can't be banned because such a prohibition, it really curtails or impinges upon a woman's greater so-called reproductive freedom, which means her so-called right to abortion. And I think here, as it's already been touched upon, but we have to be really, really clear that there is no right to abortion in international law. And countries, it's not only that they have the prerogative, due to their sovereign status, they have the prerogative to protect unborn life, but really under international law, they also have a duty to do so. And we know that sadly, This is really contravened in many parts of the world today. But apart from this, you really can't make the argument, no argument in favor of a woman's so-called right to choose can make up for the fact that this, at its very essence, really is an issue of women's rights that threatens her very right to life and our very equality. So discrimination against women, both in and outside of the womb, can never be sanctioned in the name of a woman's right to abortion. And on the flip side, likewise, no claim that abortion is legal in a country, so just because a country permits abortion, can ever justify the inaction of a state to recognize sex-selective abortion, which is why what's happening in Canada is so important. You can't just say, well, abortion is legal in our country, so I guess this discriminatory practice is okay. We're not going to work to eradicate it. Along a similar line, you also hear the argument that laws that ban sex-selective abortion are racist. This is something that I'm very familiar with in my own national context as an American. And I think, again, the response to this needs to be very clear, which is that, yes, such laws, they do primarily impact certain ethnic and cultural populations. And these are the populations within which the practice transpires most frequently, even though we do see that it does happen to some extent across all cultures. But where there are laws banning sex-selective abortion, they must apply to everyone indiscriminately. So they don't apply to one culture versus another. They do apply to everyone. And claims pertaining to racism, again, they can't be used to justify discriminatory targeting of the right to life of girls in the womb. That's akin to saying that a person's culture allows them to engage in any particular human rights abuse. It's a cultural thing, so that's fine. And for this reason, we can't combat it by legal means, even though we know how catastrophic the implications of this practice are. So fourth, you also get the view that populations are growing, they're swelling, and that there is need for restrictive population policies. And in this view, rather than really relying on authentic solutions to problems that ensue from population growth, so relying on our creativity and our ingenuity to really solve problems that are caused by growing populations, particularly in the developing world, the emphasis here is on really limiting and restricting population size. And this almost always, whenever this transpires, it ends up directly violating the right that we have enshrined in international law to determine our family size. So every person has the right to determine their family size for themselves. And this is not to mention that if countries are concerned with population size, the family size, the number of children that a woman has, typically adjusts naturally when the government places the focus on ensuring that women have equal treatment in their societies, that they have equal access to opportunities in school, in work, and in public life. Restrictive population controls, on the other hand, when the focus is on that, on really curtailing population, they lead to the phenomenon which is known as fertility squeeze. And of course, we can look to the example of China. The National Family Planning Policy prior to 2015, the one-child policy as it was known, that policy was interesting because it allowed parents in rural areas to have a second child, so to have one more kid, only if the first child was a girl. So what does this say about what it means to have a girl in China? And policies and programs of this kind, they inherently violate human rights. And they contribute, of course, how could they not, to this overarching culture of discrimination in which girls are perceived as less than. So what's to be done? This number, 140 million females around the world missing today. That's a number that we've heard several times tonight. It comes from UNFPA, I believe, originally. And what's interesting here, that number sounds pretty catastrophic, but actually the methodology that was used to establish this number and the reliability of the statistic is a little bit murky. And it's actually suspected that this is a severe underestimation and that the numbers are actually much, much greater. So we're dealing with, closer to potentially 200 million. It's not clear, but the answer kind of lies here. So what we do need is more reliable data on both the real magnitude of the problem, on the social and health consequences, on the impact of interventions, what works, what doesn't. Without this data, we really don't have a sound evidence base for making coordinated policy development, for actually figuring out action. And we can point to the lack of reliable and comprehensive data on this practice as a problem, because it really does stop us from identifying good solutions. So when you hear claims that laws and policies that are aimed to end sex-selective abortion haven't worked, or they're not effective, or there's no point, really these are unfounded and they're deceptive, because we just don't have the numbers to substantiate that, and we very much need them. So to this end, there are a variety of steps that really need to be taken. The first one is laws. Governments need to bring their legislation in line with their human rights obligations, and this entails preventing sex selection before birth. 2, states need to develop the legislation and policy frameworks in general to address the root causes that drive sex selection. So, you can see this in the Indian example where they outlawed dowry and they made the inheritance laws. Again, it's not sufficient, but it certainly does serve as a foundation for these policies. And all such legislation, it just needs to be strictly enforced. That's very clear, that if you're going to see countrywide elimination of this practice, the laws need to be enforced, people need to be held accountable. The general role of raising social awareness about equal rights of men and women, that's obviously very important to shift cultural norms. And we need to see advocacy, awareness raising, things such as this, that stimulate discussion and debate, that include civil society, and that really start to strengthen and expand consensus around the equal value of girls and boys starting in the womb. So I think that I'll wrap up here. Like Mattea reminded us at the onset of this panel, it really is pertinent to the Commission on the Status of Women to be discussing this. Beijing, which is the document that the Commission is based on, that the Commission harkens back to, states committed in that text to really eliminating this practice and to identifying it as a harmful practice. At the end of the day, the victims of this practice, they're unseen. At the same time, I think the case study that I went through, it really shows how you can see and you can feel their loss. It really does have so many corresponding human rights abuses that ensue as a result. So it's really in the name of these girls that we continue to press forward on this issue. And we hope for a day when we can achieve not just the elimination of this practice, but really of violence and discrimination against women and girls at large. So that's all from me. I thank you, and happy to answer any questions at the end.
Thank you, Elyssa, for your work and for your presentation. That was very comprehensive. I truly do appreciate it. We are now moving into this section of our program for Q&A. So if you do have questions, which I've been receiving through private DMs on this platform, please go to the chat box and send them to all panelists or all panelists and attendees. So some of the questions I've received thus far, I will direct towards individuals as specified. So the first question that came in was for MP Wagantall, and it is as follows. Is sex-selective abortion truly a concern, or is it just being used by anti-choice groups as a smokescreen to criminalize a woman's right to choose?
Thank you so much for that question. It is one that I have faced, not in the question as much as the accusation that this is just a ploy to try to make a change in our society, where the majority of women, the majority of people want access to abortion. But that in itself actually clarifies that no, that's not the case. When 84% of Canadians indicate that they want sex-selective abortion to be illegal in Canada, I can assure you that that is the significant portion of that number would be people who consider themselves pro-choice. So that in itself nullifies that whole argument that somehow this is a move to make a change on the sly, shall we say. My bill, Cassie and Molly's law, didn't have anything to do with abortion. In that case, a woman who was pregnant and wanting to carry her child to term, who was attacked by a third party. So from the outside, someone who could see that she was pregnant or knew that she was pregnant and attacked her and caused death or injury to the mother as well as to the fetus, to the child. In that case in Canada, there's no recognition of that child's death, even though the mother is in a circumstance where she wanted to carry that baby to term. And so unfortunately, the abortion debate got in the way of dealing with an issue in our criminal law where women are suffering. And also in this case with Cassie, her partner, Jeff, faced losing Molly, and he lost Cassie as well, and just dumbfounded that there was no law in Canada that recognized, even in my case, was asking for a second offense in regards to the woman. So we can no longer allow this non-truthful debate to continue, where the impression is that Canadians are so polarized on this issue that we can't use common sense and deal with issues around equality and violence.
Thank you for that answer. The next question we have was for Dr. Williams. How would you stop the discriminatory practice of sex-selective abortions, which predominantly target baby girls in utero, while having legal abortion in your country?
So as you've heard tonight, in Canada, what happened in Canada, it's not that, what they did was they made abortions not illegal. So it's kind of technical. So they're in this sort of no man's land that nobody will touch. So yes, we don't have any, in Canada, you can get an abortion and not be held accountable in the law as many times as you want for any reason you want at any stage in your pregnancy. That's where we're at. So when we're looking at sex selective abortions in a country where abortion is very, very legal, very accessible, what we need to do, and this applies to any time we want to end gender-based violence or really violence of any kind, we need to amplify the humanity of the victim. Because when we start to see each other, there's so many things that divide us on so many levels. When we look past that, at the core of what makes us human, we are all united. We are all part of one human family, and all these things that divide us melt away. So if we had dedicated resources to really good campaigns, legislative, government, non-government, grassroots, all of these things, promoting the humanity of the girl child, it would stop. As soon as people see the girl child as a valuable human, it would stop. So all of the things that we've said before, where girls are looked at like, oh, well, they're quite expensive, they're not quite worth the investment. All of these really dehumanizing things, or if it's the language we use, or if it's the restrictions we put on them. As soon as we see the girl child as like us and not unlike us, that's when we start to change things. That's when we really make changes. So for any human rights abuse to continue, two things have to happen. It has to be largely unseen, because if people don't see it, they're not thinking about it and they're not outraged by it. And the second thing is that they cannot identify with the victim. So the two things that need to happen are, we need to bring this issue into the light, and we need to emphasize the humanity of the girl child. And if we do those two things, it will stop.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Williams. Next up is a question for Elyssa. How is sex-selective abortions affecting populations globally? For example, how are missing girls affecting economies, mental and physical health of nations, etc.?
I think that's exactly the question, and that is something that we can infer from the numbers that we do have from the research that UNFPA has provided. We have the statistics. We do have the numbers to substantiate that this has enormous economic and other effects. At the same time, we don't know exactly how bad it is because we don't have all of the data. So I think that with regard to your question, I don't know. I can infer, just as you can, that with regard to the developing world, this is one of their greatest scourges. We assemble all of these government representatives and civil society actors to come together at the CSW to really talk about what it means to empower women and girls. But without giving due attention to this issue, none of that really means anything. And so I think that your question is exactly spot on. And this is why a lot of the work that we should be doing really needs to be pressuring the agencies of the UN that have the capacity to get out there and gather this data, to ask them to really, provide the numbers so that we can see the economic effects. And while this doesn't exactly provide a face to the victims in the way that it's just been described. I think it's part of that package, because if you're able to show economically how this ravages the country, if you're able to show all of the other human rights abuses that ensue, I think that really is going to be pivotal and just so helpful to making the case that the practice needs to be abolished and eliminated for good.
Wonderful, thank you. So the next one is going to be back to Dr. Williams, but I'd like to open it up to anyone and everyone who would like to jump in on this question. And it's as follows. How many sex-selective abortions happen in Canada annually? And what does it say about Canada's feminist government refusing to address this form of discrimination?
So those numbers don't exist. They haven't been largely compiled on a national scale. There's been no work that I'm aware of to do that. So what has happened is there have been pockets at different times in, for example, BC, Ontario. I'm currently practicing in Alberta, where they'll publish local data. But if you look, if you wanted to look for something federally from the federal government on this, the numbers don't exist. It has been spoken about in the medical literature. The Canadian Medical Association have addressed it in their journal, peer-reviewed journal, but it's very, very hard to get the actual numbers. What does that say about a feminist government? Well, if I want to be gracious to the government, I'll say we're doing, currently we're in a pandemic like all other governments. We haven't always been in a pandemic though. And I think any government that wants to position itself as caring for women and girls, being a feminist government, needs to address this issue because this is the one place where, like we said earlier, the greatest violation of human rights is violating someone's right to life, because without that fundamental right, they can't have any other rights. So this really, really does need to be addressed. The reason it's not addressed is because it's unseen. When I spoke about that example about the 3-year-old girl, if there were 3-year-old girls losing their lives from medical practitioners at the rates that we're seeing this for unborn girls, there would be enormous outrage. So like I said before, we do not see our humanity in these tiny girls. So we need to, and our government needs to, and any feminist government needs to. And to be quite honest, I'm not sure that the numbers matter that much, because I don't think this should happen to any females. So I don't think we need large numbers to be largely outraged. I think if this was happening, if I saw 5 3-year-old girls, I would be ridiculously upset. So hopefully that helps. At less than 5, to be honest.
I do appreciate that. It does humanize the situation greatly. It really, for all of us, I believe, to understand that this is happening inside the womb where we can't see, but if it was happening outside of the womb, we would be outraged, and we should be, because it is still happening in utero. Alrighty, so I did have a question just come in from one of our attendees, and it is there any work being done by any organizations to obtain the statistical data regarding sex-selective abortions? And it doesn't clarify if it's just in Canada or abroad, so if there are organizations in Canada or elsewhere, do any of you have an answer to that question?
I don't know if there is any work being done by that, but and maybe Elyssa could comment more on this because she's looked at the numbers more, but when they do calculate these, it's based off of, like we said, naturally, you should have, for every 100 girl babies, you should have approximately 105 boy babies. So you can calculate this, and this is where the missing number comes in, is they look at what this discrepancy is between the babies who are, how many girl babies are born and how many boy babies are born. And this isn't actually that difficult to get, because we do collect national data on how many babies are born every year and what the gender is. So it could be calculated. I'm not aware of any organization specifically that is doing that currently, but it in theory wouldn't be that difficult for someone to do.
Yeah, I think there is some of that going on in the background with Real Women, different organizations that do access to information trying to get statistics, Canadian statistics and that type of thing. But yeah, the truth of the matter is we don't have any means of doing that because there isn't a lot of records kept in regards to abortion, obviously in Canada. So that's something that would, as was said earlier, a big difference in trying to make proper determinations of what's going on and what needs to happen going forward. So, yeah.
Very good. Alrighty, well, our next question was pointed towards MP Wagantall. Is sex-selective abortion an issue that groups who believe women have a right to abortion can support? If so, are there examples of how we can work together to protect baby girls and support their mothers?
There's not enough being done, but I think the more that we come together on this issue with at least legislation in Canada, it opens up all kinds of opportunities for us to do far better in protecting baby girls. There's no question that legislation is important in defining that. We also need more focus in our country, and this is an issue that was brought up actually during our leadership race in our political party, is that we need more pregnancy counseling centers. And along with that 84% number in the poll that indicated the majority of Canadians want to see sex-selective abortion, they also want to see far more pregnancy counseling centers, and they want doctors to have to provide all of the information around this particular procedure that indicates where those risks are, because a lot of times that information isn't being given to women as either. So I really think the legislation is that foundation that we need to build on in Canada, because by doing that, we're revealing that the majority of Canadians are unified on this issue. And that's something that we desperately need in our country, is opportunities where we can come together. And in this case, it's a human story. It's a reality for women. Tonight, when I'm finished here, I'll be going to the House for a take note debate. The government has decided that we need to debate tonight on the spur of the moment femicide in response to the number of deaths of women in Quebec recently, the violence that's going on. And so I have an opportunity there to go and talk as well about the dynamics here that we're talking about tonight, because this is an issue that is specifically in regards to violence against women. And there are women who lose their lives because of that coercion that comes from a partner that does not want her to carry that child.
Lots of heavy information, but nonetheless important to discuss. Thank you, MP Wagantall. Alrighty, next question is pointed towards Elyssa. What is the international community doing or not doing to combat this form of discrimination and violence against women and girls?
Yeah, I think, when it comes to the UN, having specific reference to the words, sex-selective abortion, I think we can't underestimate the importance of that. Obviously, the documents that emanate from the UN at the level that we're talking about, these are documents of political will, so they don't constitute international law. And when a government walks away with a CSW document or even with a General Assembly document, none of these things bind countries to take any certain action one way or the other. At the same time, we know that they're hugely important when it comes to norm setting, and that when the texts that are developed, negotiated, and then kind of rubber stamped at the UN land on the desk of a country minister, that minister is going to go through them and going to look and see, like, where is my country lining up and where are they not? And there's tremendous sums of funding, of financial aid in particular for countries of the developing world, that come hand in hand with, every word that goes into these documents is going to be allocated a certain amount of dollars, and that's usually tremendous sums. So with regard to what the international community is doing, what it should be doing is getting specific reference to this and similar human rights abuses in actual UN documents. So instead of talking about things that are controversial, that actually have nothing to do with international law, and that actually stand to violate countries' national sovereignty on social issues. So for example, on the issue of abortion, instead of trying to imply that there is somehow an international human right to abortion and that countries need to all line up and change their laws on abortion because the UN said so, which is completely unfounded. What they should be doing is they should be talking about issues of human rights concern that impact everyone and that disproportionately impact women. They should be calling them out and calling on countries to adopt legislation, to prosecute them, to go through all the things that we listed, and to very clearly spell that out in a UN resolution, UN documents. That's invaluable. And I think we'll be seeing more of that. I think that you really are seeing countries waking up to the reality of this because of what we've already discussed, because of all the problems that it causes for them. So I think that internationally, the trend will improve on this.
Thank you very much. We have one last question in about 8 minutes until our recording ends. So the last question is open to any panelists. Why shouldn't pregnant people have the right to decide what sex of child they want to give birth to?
I can start with that, and then I'd welcome anybody else to jump in. So the definitions that I gave were high school biology level definitions. They're not controversial. They're in every textbook. Those are the definitions of life. That's when a new human genetic code starts that's different from either parent is at fertilization. And like we said, if you took an abortion is killing of an embryo. If you want to kill something, it has to be alive first. So if you kill a little girl at any stage, that's a violation of her human right. So that shouldn't be a preference that parents have, because we're talking about human rights violations. If we were talking about preferences only, not human rights violation, you could look at sperm sorting, which does exist. You need to look at the sperm because the sperm, all the female eggs carry an X chromosome, and the sperm either has an X or a Y. And you need 2 X's to make a female and an X and a Y to make a male. So you could preferentially determine what gender of baby you want to have based on that, what biological gender of baby you want to have based on that. That would be preferring either a male or a female based on their sex alone. And if you look in human rights documents, that is discrimination. So either way, it meets the definition of discrimination. So the question is really, why can't parents discriminate against their children? And I think when you phrase it in that form, it's a cause for pause. Maybe we think that it's not necessarily that good of a question. Although it is worthwhile asking and answering, I would say. And if we decide that, sure, parents should be able to choose that, I guess, where does that take us? Then why should parents be okay to discriminate based on gender, but not other forms of discrimination based on other things? People call it a slippery slope, but the slippery slope argument is actually the next logical step. So whenever you're talking about an argument and somebody's like, oh, if you do that, this is going to happen. Now, oh, no, the slippery slope. It's not a slippery slope. It's a next logical step. And so you always need to look at it from that frame of reference as well. Because we're free to choose, but we're not necessarily free from the consequences of our choices. So we have to carefully evaluate, okay, maybe I can do that, but where's it going to take me? And is that where I want to go? So hopefully that helps, but I'm happy to hear from anybody else as well.
Yeah, I guess it's a question of truly valuing the incredible, significant uniqueness of being a woman and being the one to carry children. My question would be, why would you want to make that decision? And I'm a little older than most of you gals. In my generation, it was a surprise. You know, you had that baby, it's a girl, it's a boy. There wasn't this predetermining of so many things that we're, like you say, kind of we're capable of. But I think we need to take that broader look at all of humanity and all of life and determine what really makes life better. And when a woman is willing to make that kind of a choice, it robs it of the joy of everything that makes it so special. To try to predetermine that decision. We're saying then that we value one type of human being over another. And I mean, it does happen. There are circumstances where there's this desire for a designer family. And if you already have a little boy, you want a girl. Okay, that's that same type of thinking that just makes me think we really need to take a look at what we are choosing to make our priorities as human beings.
Thank you, MP Wagantall and Dr. Williams, for taking that question. It can be quite contentious and controversial, so I appreciate your very wholesome answers greatly. And with that, we end our discussion on protecting the rights of women and girls from discriminatory practice of sex-selective abortion. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I greatly appreciate the conversation. And to each one of our panelists, thank you so much, both for the work you do and for driving forward human rights and the protection thereof. So thank you all. If you want to get connected with any one of our panelists, they are on Twitter and on Facebook. And if you want to look up MP Cathay Wagantall's bill, Bill C-233, we have put it in the chat for you all to look up. So thank you all for joining us again, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you very much.